Hello, my name is Travis Zimmerman. I'm the site manager here at the Mille Lacs Indian Museum and Trading Post, a historic site of the Minnesota Historical Society. Each year, thousands of school kids come up to the museum for field trips. And because of unfortunate events this spring, that means many children were not able to experience the Four Seasons room. We also know that many parents at this time are involved with distance learning with their children, so we wanted to provide a special Four Seasons tour that children all across Minnesota and throughout the United States could access to learn more about the Ojibwe people. The Four Seasons room is meant to portray typical Ojibwe living in about the mid-1700s. That's when the Ojibwe moved into this area of Minnesota. So I'm going to start and I'm going to talk about each season and some of the activities involved with each season. And I might ask you a few questions along the way to see what you think. The springtime, the Ojibwe would move from their winter camp to their springtime camp, and this was called their sugar bushing camp. This is where they would tap the maple trees for their sap that they would then boil down and make into sugar. The way they traditionally gathered the sap from the tree was to carve a V shape into the outer bark of the tree. They would then pound a small wooden tap underneath that V and place a birch bark container or muckuk underneath to catch the sap. Once that muckuk was full of sap, they would take it and pour it into the cast iron kettles here. Once those kettles were full, they would start to boil down the sap to make it into syrup. Now, because over 90% of the sap is water, how many gallons of sap do you think it takes to boil down to 1 gallon of syrup? Do you think you know? Well, I'll tell you. It takes anywhere from 30 to 40 gallons of sap to boil down to 1 gallon of syrup. Once the Ojibwe would have boiled the sap down to syrup, they would have continued to boil the syrup and start to still evaporate even more moisture out of it until it would get light, foamy, and airy and start to bubble up and look like it was about to rise out of the kettle. At that moment, they would take and pour it into a wooden trough like this, usually made out of basswood. And as you can see, this woman here has a wooden spoon, and what she's doing is as it cools, she is granulating that into sugar crystals to make maple sugar. They would produce most of the sap into sugar because sugar preserved better, stayed better throughout the year, and also it was easier to pack into large birch bark containers so that they could then carry it on to the next season. Oftentimes, they would build little shelters like this to keep all their supplies in. Since this is the only time that the maple trees ran, they wouldn't need the taps or their small muckucks for gathering sap until the spring next year. So they would keep all their supplies here, and then next year, when it was time to sugar bush again, they would come and retrieve their supplies and do it all over. They might do the same thing with their shelters, is they might keep the poles up or the structure or the frame of the shelter, but they definitely would take the birch bark sheets like you see here, roll them up with them to bring to the next camp for their shelter. After the springtime, they would move their camps to their summer camp, and here they would move to the shores of a lake. The main activity in the early spring was netting fish and spearing fish. Throughout the summer, they would also line and hook fish as the fish moved further out in the waters. Another activity in the summertime was gathering berries, like this young lady here. She's gathering some raspberries and blackberries growing next to the wigwam here. But Minnesota has many different wild berries that grow throughout the spring, into the summer, into the fall. so they would constantly be gathering different berries. They would also be gathering different plants, herbs, and roots, some which would be used for food, some for medicine, and some of them would be used to dye materials different colors. Another activity in the summertime was gathering the birch bark. Late June, early July is the best time to go out and gather the bark off the birch tree. Most trees, if you take their outer bark off, it hurts the tree, and it's their protective covering, so without it they would most likely die. That's not the case with the birch tree. You can take off the outer bark of the birch, from the birch tree, and it'll actually grow back. So about 5 or 6 years later, you can go back to that same tree, and it will have regrown its bark. And as you can see, birch bark is a very important material. Not only was it used for their lodges, they used it for their baskets, and they also used it for their birch bark canoes. Another activity in the summertime was gardening. One of the most common gardens in this area was the Three Sisters Garden. Do you know what makes up the Three Sisters Garden? What plants those are? I'll give you a second to think about it. Did you guess? The Three Sisters are corn, beans, and squash. The corn and the beans are planted alongside each other in a mound, with the hopes that as the bean grow up, it'll have the corn stalk that will help it climb upwards as it grows. The squash, if planted around the corn and the beans with its prickly leaves and stems, keeps your chipmunks and rabbits from chewing up your garden. But if you've ever grown squash, you'll know it kind of takes over the garden too. So much so that other things can't even grow, like weeds and some smaller plants. So it really helps with weeding the garden. And then from the beans provide phosphate for the soil. And phosphate is an important fertilizer that helps the rest of the plants grow and gives you healthy soil. From their summer camps, they would move to their fall camps, and here they would move to the shores of a river or lake, but the difference would be it would be someplace where wild rice is growing on the water. Wild rice doesn't grow everywhere. It needs a certain depth, and it needs a certain temperature. It also needs a free-flowing current to grow. Here you can see in the background, two people in a canoe are harvesting the wild rice. You have one person, that's the puller, that stands up in the boat with a long pole, 15 to 16 feet long, and he uses that pole to push off on the bottom of the river or the lake. As he's pushing the canoe through the wild rice bed, there's another person that has knocking sticks that's pulling the rice stalks into the canoe and knocking the ripe rice kernels into the canoe. Sometimes those kernels go back into the water, which is okay because then the crop is being reseeded for next year. Here we have demonstration of how the Ojibwe would process the wild rice. The first step in processing the rice is parching the rice, and that's what this lady's doing here with a cast iron kettle. Over a low flame, she's stirring the rice, drying it out, starting to crack the husk around the kernels of rice open, but also by parching it, this preserves the wild rice and hardens it. After the parching, the next step is called threshing or jigging, or sometimes they call it dancing the rice, because this man here is stepping on the rice and he would be twisting his feet as he steps on the rice so as to remove the husk from the kernels of rice. You'll notice the A-frame support here that he's using to support his weight, so he doesn't put all his weight on the rice because he doesn't want to crush up the kernels. Then the last step in processing the rice is winnowing the rice. And that's what the lady's doing with the winnowing tray here. Now that the husks have been crushed into small pieces of little dried grass, they're very lightweight. Winnowing is to throw the rice and the husk up in the air and kind of sift it. And as the husks fly into the air, they're very lightweight. They will fly away if there's even a little breeze. The breeze will help blow them away. The kernels of rice are heavier, so they'll fall back into your basket. And once you have processed wild rice like this, it'll stay good for years and years as long as you keep it away from moisture and don't get it wet. Then from their ricing camp, the Ojibwe would move to their winter camp. But before they did that, they would store their canoes. Do you know how the Ojibwe would store their canoes for the winter? If you said they would sink them in a lake, you're correct. They would sink them in a lake during the winter time and retrieve them again in the spring. In the winter time, the Ojibwe would trap different animals for their furs. They would spear fish through the ice. And they also would make clothing from the fall hunts out of animal hides. This lady here is working with the hide, and how they would make their clothing that you see them wear, their buckskin clothing, is they would take a hide, they would soak it in water and ash mixture for 3 or 4 days, and then take it out and stretch it on a frame like this that would either be between 2 trees or could be staked to the ground. They would then take scrapers and scrape off any flesh from the hide, but also the hair from the hide. After that part's done, it's like a rawhide, so it's rather hard, but there was many uses for rawhide. They used rawhide to make their hand drums. They also used rawhide for the lacings on their snowshoes, and the snowshoes helped distribute their weight so they could walk easier on the snow. But then, to get it into tanned hide, they would use a brain tanning method. And they would use the brain of the animal mixed with fats and other oils and work it into the rawhide to soften up that hide. Once it was softened up, what they would do is they would smoke the hide. So to get it to be more of a brown leather look, they would suspend the hide above a fire and let the smoke absorb into the hide, and the different types of wood you use would determine the different colors of the leather. By smoking and tanning the hide, it also would make it a little waterproof so that the material just would not absorb moisture if it got wet. Another activity in the wintertime was storytelling. Storytelling would take place, and the children would gather around the campfires in the lodges during the winter to listen to stories from their parents, their aunts and uncles, their grandparents, other elders of the tribe. And these stories would talk about their family history. Tribal history would include origin stories, creation stories, migration stories. But the stories also had morals and values and lessons embedded in them, so that the children would learn from these stories on how to live a life of a good Anishinaabe. Many of these stories were only told when there was snow on the ground. And even today, out of respect for that tradition, many Ojibwe storytellers will only tell certain stories when there is snow on the ground. One last question I had for you that we often get from visitors is how would they stay warm during the winter time? What do you think? Did you have any guesses? How do you stay warm during the winter time? One of the ways was they would use furs. They had furs of different animals that they would use. Some were big enough to wrap around themselves as shawls. Some of the hides were smaller, like rabbit hides, or muskrat hides, or even squirrel hides. And those would be used to line their mittens and their moccasins so their fingers and toes would be protected from frostbite. Another thing they did to keep warm in the lodge at night is before they built a fire pit, they would dig up the whole ground where their lodge was going to be set up, and they would have lines of rocks coming out from the fireplace underneath the ground. So when that fire was burning and they would submerge that fire a little bit, they would dig a pit for the fireplace. As that fire burned, it would warm up the rocks that were buried in the soil and that were spread out all around the floor, so they would have had a heated floor effect. Another thing they would do is they would line the inside of their lodges, and they would use the bulrush or the cattail mats, and in between the birch bark and the bulrush, they would stuff moss, pine balls, dried grasses, leaves, other things, so that it would keep the lodge insulated throughout the winter time. Thank you for joining us for this special tour. We hope you enjoyed it. We have nothing but the best wishes for all of you and your families. Miigwech, thank you, and stay safe.